Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. My name is Jason Gale, and I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith, our lecturer in philosophy. And before we get started today, I want to let our listeners know of today's topic. We're going to be looking at one of Dr. Smith's upcoming courses. And so I want to invite all of our listeners to check out all of our classes in both philosophy and theology over at Catholic Studies Academy. You can join us as a subscribing member, and you'll have access ongoing to a multitude of courses, or you can simply just purchase the courses you want outright. For right now, the price, I believe, is $47. So you can purchase those courses outright and just own them and have access to them for a lifetime. And you'll also have access to our members-only forum, where the lecturers interact with different members of Catholic Studies Academy, and we do not allow trolls in there. So it's a good and open and honest discussion between armchair scholars and everybody that falls in between. So, all right. So to get started in today's topic, we're going to look at Dr. Smith's upcoming course, The Crisis of Philosophy, specifically looking at the years 1900 to 2000. And so I think here we're getting really into almost we're going to be talking about philosophy, but we're getting into the practical, because these are really the things that have shaped our modern world,
right?
Very much. And I think for a lot of our listeners, and myself included, sometimes I think we just sit back and we say, gosh, what the hell happened?
Right.
And it goes back to, a good premise that we believe here at Catholic Studies Academy, is that ideas have consequences.
That's right.
And so Dr. Smith's new course is going to be looking at this period of philosophy from 1900 to 2000. So Dr. Smith, to get us started here, maybe you can kind of philosophically introduce us, or within the historicity of philosophy, how do we get to this point? What sets up this time period of 1900 to the year 2000?
Sure, Jason. So there's as with all things, right? If we're going to study philosophy from 1900 to 2000, we also then need to know something about, the 100 years before that, right?
Yeah.
To kind of set things up. But I think, just as an aside, I think this is going to be a really valuable course, because like you said, sometimes we just don't know. You're like, why is everything this way? And one thing I've tried to spend a lot of time doing in the last, 5 years is trying to really improve my understanding of the history of philosophy in the modern period and up through into the 20th century. Sometimes I'll hear phrases like postmodernism or existentialism or something like that. You're like, well, where did that come from? I mean, why is it here? Where did it come from? That kind of thing. Yeah. There's a history there. And then this course, we're going to kind of uncover that history. So I think it'll be really useful to all the students who study it. Getting started here, when you're thinking about the 20th century thought, which I do label as a crisis, and I know our last podcast was about a crisis as well. And what can I say? This is just where we are right here, but at this point, but I do label it as a crisis because I think that our contemporary setting, or 20th century philosophy, has created a situation in which, because of our lack of conceptual tools, and because of the sort of flawed conceptual framework that we've been left with, we really have almost complete collapse of our ability to have public debates. We've talked about this, in our last one. I'm really our last podcast. I'm really interested in this idea of public reason, and I think that public reason's almost entirely collapsed at this point. Right? We just have no conceptual, common philosophical framework in which to operate. There's always been tensions. There's always conflict, but where we are is like, even about matters like COVID and how to respond to COVID, there's just no set of ideas that helps us to navigate disagreements about that, all right, in terms of how to respond. And even our over reliance on on certain things, maybe, right, can go back to this history that we're going to talk about in a very broad and sweeping terms today. So if you're going to look at 20th century philosophy, you need to think a little bit about 19th century philosophy. And for sure, the greatest influence there is Immanuel Kant, right? Mm-hmm. His transcendental idealism really sets the stage for subsequent philosophical developments. Transcendental idealism, we've talked about this before on the podcast, but just very briefly, Kant came to the conclusion that we can only know the phenomena that we experience insofar as the mind has shaped the data of experience to be knowable by us, right? Yeah. So, in this way, the objects, truth happens when objects conform to the way the human mind can know, right? And anything outside of that, right, is just unknowable by the human mind. It might be known by something else, but not by us, right?
Yeah. So at best, it breeds just skepticism of everything. At best,
skepticism of external reality, right?
Yeah.
Now, Kant believed that he had correctly identified the universal structures of reason and the universal structures of a knowing mind. So he thought that this was a world that we shared, the world of phenomena, right? And that, like you didn't have your own individual phenomena that's wildly different than mine, right? So he wasn't a subjectivist in that way. But he did think that we were cut off, right, from reality, right? So he did so insist that there was a reality outside of the human experience and outside the human mind, but we just can't know it, right? All we can know is the data given an experience as it's shaped to be knowable by the human mind, right? So think about it this way, like it's kind of almost like you've got this Play-Doh, right? Or clay or whatever. And, we can only see squares. So we stamp squares, right, onto that clay. And we say, hey, look, there's squares, right? And then there's like, maybe that's a poor example, but maybe an analogy limps a little bit. But this way, what the mind does, it stamps certain ideas on the data of experience, like space, time, cause, and effect. We don't experience space, time, cause, and effect directly from reality. Rather, we impose categories on the data of experience so that we can understand it, right?
Yeah. And I've heard this kind of get played out, and I'm sure maybe some of our listeners have heard it as well. Is when people maybe give you the statement, well, God is just man's projection on things he cannot really know.
Sure. Yeah.
It's this playing out of almost in a false humility of things like that. And so Kant had a huge effect on this whole time period of philosophy then.
That's right. Yeah. And really, even in German culture, even today, he's kind of revered. I briefly for a year I had some roommates who were German when I was in university at college, and they were always referred to Kant as the last universal genius.
Wow.
But anyways, but at the time he was really popular. One of the reasons I firmly believe is he made room for agnosticism. Right. All of the old arguments for the existence of God go away because all we know is the phenomena, right? We don't know the thing itself. And so ultimately, right, we have to be agnostic about everything. You might be, well, what's so great about that? Well, to a lot of people at the time, not a lot of people, for a particular class, really, the rising middle class of the time, especially the youth of that class, they saw this as exciting, right? Because so much of German culture and society, conservative and traditional, have been backed up by, if you were in a Catholic region, of course, Catholicism or Lutheranism. And once, once agnosticism became intellectually respectable, right? Then you're like, to them, that's like, oh, I can cast off the traditions. I can cast off, right, all of that. So it was very liberating, right? To many people to have a philosophy that made Newtonian science possible on the one hand, but on the other, legitimized agnosticism. Now, of course, later, as soon as Kant, publishes this material, there's of course also strong negative reactions, and one of the reactions is, well, one, how do you know that the structures of reason you found are actually universal, right?
Yeah.
How do you know that we all share the same world? And second, how do you even know there is a thing in itself, right? I mean, if all we know is the phenomena, then why posit a reality outside that phenomena? And eventually that second question led to those two questions together really led to a pivot away from transcendental idealism, which was mainly, sometimes we should call it critical idealism, right? Because it was really more of epistemological. There were what Kant did is he ended metaphysics, but he just said, look, all we can know is the phenomena, and we just have to be agnostic about metaphysics, right? There was a pivot away from that to what's called absolute idealism, right? And that's where you get various thinkers culminating in Hegel, right? Who have the view that to be is to be perceived, or another way to put it is all of reality is mental, or all of reality is spiritual, right?
Yeah.
So there is no reality outside of mind, right? Is what is a way to put it, right? And did you have a question or comment there, Jason?
Yeah, well, I mean, Kant's position, it does seem kind of self-defeating in that, if the only thing we can know is the phenomena, how does he come about how is his structure true? Because you don't necessarily experience the structure of thinking in phenomena.
Sure. Yeah.
So,
yeah. I mean, what Kant would say is, what I've deduced are the a priori necessary conditions of the possibility of any experience, right? But yeah, I agree. I mean, there's a lack of self-reflection there, right?
So the pendulum swings.
That's right. It swings,
to the other side.
Yeah, absolute idealism. Which is really a fascinating period to study, fascinating set of metaphysics. When I teach metaphysics class, sometimes I go through some of that history because it's so strange to think, and it's how did we get to that spot? But eventually, Hegel's, and again, I'm just being very just 5,000 feet kind of view of this, right? But Hegel, says, look, what we have to do is recognize that mind, right? That there isn't anything that exists outside of mind. And then to understand reality, really, you have to understand mind, and in order to understand mind, you need to understand its unfolding. He recognized a really interesting problem, which is that in order to understand, right, the deliverances of reason, you need to understand reason. But in order to do that, that's an act of reason itself. So you can't be sure of the deliverances of your views about reasoning when you're using reasoning, right? So there's a circularity there. Do you follow the problem there?
Oh, yeah.
So you could come up with all sorts of ideas about reason, but until you know how to use reason properly, you can't be sure of those ideas that you came up about reason, right?
Yeah, it's maddening.
So
how does he get around this? Yeah.
History.
Okay.
What we can do is just, he literally says, look, right? And that if we look at the unfolding of reason over time, then we will come to understand mind. And by coming to understand mind, come to understand reality, right?
Yeah.
And what he discovers, supposedly, is that what the meaning of history and the meaning of reason is the self-consciousness of reason's freedom. Right.
Yeah.
And that's what we see over time is it's unfolding from ancient Greece all the way to 19th century Germany. Right.
Yeah.
Is this constant growth in reason's self-awareness of its own freedom and autonomy.
Yeah.
Interesting idea, isn't it?
Yeah. And with Hegel, he doesn't just look backwards at kind of the history of ideas and things like that, but he looks forward to the high point of history when we will have this kind of autonomous being of freedom or something like that.
There will be a total realization of our freedom reason's freedom in the establishment of the completely rational state.
Yeah.
So it becomes political in that way, right?
Yeah. And Marx picks it up.
Yeah,
right?
Sure. And you can feel, tones of this. I mean, there is a kind of utopian / dystopian, right, feel to that, at least to my inclinations. There's a metaphysical picture that goes with that, right, which is that all of reality, the trees, the badgers, your mind, the Battle of Waterloo, all of it is an extension of one mind, right? Ultimately, right? Yours as well. So there's what Hegel calls the world spirit, right?
Yeah.
The world spirit is really using all of these different historical events, ideas, civilizations to figure itself out, right? And to realize its own freedom, right? So that's how there's unity to things. That's why this isn't radically subjective, right? At this point, because he sees that, there's a reality, right? And it's unified and it's uniform, right? And it's objective, right? Because there's just one mind, right? Your mind and my mind are extensions of that mind, right? But there's only one ultimate mind, right? And everything is its thought, right? Now, that was for some, that was really compelling for several generations, right? In fact, that kind of vision became popular in both Britain and also in the United States of America. In America, there was still a lot of common sense Scottish philosophy that competed with it, as well as pragmatism, kind of philosophy found in William James. But idealism certainly had its proponents, say both in the UK and in the United States. And so this really becomes a dominant way of thinking, right, for a good while. But like anything else, it eventually, like a lot of philosophical ideas, it eventually sort of implodes, right? I kind of think, just the implausibility of it, right? Helps it to implode. How it all sort of slowly started to fall apart is a longer story. But one element of that was certainly what were called the young Hegelians, or the left-wing Hegelians. And that would include people like Feuerbach and Karl Marx. These folks tended to interpret, they like the idea of a kind of historical dialectic, right? Yeah. In which certain themes are unfolding, right, over time, right? They thought that was the correct way to think about it. But they wanted to naturalize it, right? So instead of saying everything is mind, right, Feuerbach wanted to move towards everything being psychology and matter, right? You could even sort of say Darwinism, right, kind of has like the development of the species over time, right? And that all has to do with survival and biology, right? Karl Marx has it as the development of everything in terms of class conflict, right? The competition for the means of production, right? Excuse me. So it's interesting to think about that, right? They take that idea and they flip it, right, to where, yes, Hegel's right that thought and culture change over time, right? Even reason changes over time, right? Maybe even being to some degree changes over time, right? Yeah, like Darwin, right? Because you have new species coming about, right? But he was wrong in terms of making it all ideal. Instead of making it ideal, it's actually material, right?
Yeah, so and all material.
Yeah, that's right. You were talking, I think, before we started about Feuerbach, being the idea that God is the projection of man, right? Of man's own powers, right? You find something similar. So we have another version of this in the work of Freud, right? Who's a 19th century figure, right? Who wants to turn everything into psychology, right? And so that becomes a major movement there. So you have Karl Marx, right? You have psychology, you have Darwinian science, all sort of pulling idealism down or flipping it on its head to some degree, right? So reversing everything from the ideal to the material. That's right. The material, but still keeping this idea of dialectical development, right? You have everything's changing, right? Which is I think sort of interesting move there, especially since really since time immemorial, the philosophical ideal, right, had been to achieve the changeless, the universal, the eternal, right? You might disagree about how you get there, but that's where everybody's trying to aspire to, right?
Yeah.
Now it's like, no, there's none of that, right? We can't get to that, right? All we can do is get to understanding within this unfolding of history, right? Dialectical, I use that phrase a couple of times here. Dialectical really just means conflicting, right? So that history develops through conflicting ideas or conflicting forces, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's important to kind of think about it this way. Idealism, absolute idealism, developed as the kind of mainstream official philosophy of the 19th century until it started to collapse in the last decades of the 19th century, right? For a variety of reasons. What we are living in is kind of the attempted successor kingdoms, I guess I would put it that way, right? I like to think about, I like history, Jason, and Alexander the Great, right? And all of his great conquests, right? Think about that. And he makes it all the way to India, right? He has this gigantic empire he patches together from all his conquered people. His army almost, as he'd go along, like he'd pick up his conquered people and bring them along with his new army, right? And so his army's changing the whole time he's marching across, I guess near Asia or Asia Minor and in the Middle East. Once he dies, then everyone's like, well, what the heck are we going to do with all this stuff, right? Because he was such a charismatic figure. And I kind of think that's the case with idealism, Once idealism dies, we're kind of left with the competitors to take the place of idealism, right? They're all fighting it out, right? And one of those competitors was psychologism, right? Psychologism is a view advocated by a number of thinkers in the 19th century, including John Stuart Mill, that wanted to reduce all epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics to psychology, right? Yeah. So that, basically Freudian psychology becomes, or something like that, becomes the first philosophy, right? So, we're not even going to argue about epistemological things as being first. We're going to argue about kind of psychological, emotional substructures, right? And mental phenomena as first, right? So your feelings about shame or guilt, right, are prior to your philosophy, right? Yeah. Isn't that interesting?
And at first I think you could say, okay, well, it seems there might be something to that, because before I asked the question, what is shame, I experienced shame maybe in some way. So there's kind of maybe a chronological primacy to experience or something like that.
Yeah. You can see going that way, and probably the most powerful proponent of this would be Friedrich Nietzsche, right? Who talks about everything in terms of, right, really it's our psychological needs, right? Or strengths or weaknesses, right? That predetermine our philosophical trajectory, right? Plato comes up with the world of eternal and unchangeable forms because he needs them, right? He lives in this world of flux and corruption and imperfection, and he just can't stand it, right? So he invents the world of the forms for its sort of metaphysical comfort. So it's interesting, right? So you really, you reduce all ideas, logic, all that sort of thing to psychological conditioning, right? Now that had its day, but it didn't ever really become dominant, I would say, but it certainly was a stream. And a number of thinkers responded to it who really were the originators of the tradition that's come to be known as phenomenology, right? Now, I would say that actually phenomenology is, it's really the root of what people call continental philosophy, right? So if you were in a modern philosophical department, in most schools, right, you would take a course on analytic philosophy, and you would take a course on continental philosophy, right? Those being the two major streams of 20th century philosophy, right? Now, obviously, this is a very British way of putting it because it's the British who call it, oh, that's a philosophy like they do over there on the continent, right?
Yeah.
Right? Not like we do over here on the island, right?
Yeah.
But anyways, so, but it does sort of hang together, and I think phenomenology is really the root of continental philosophy. Again, going back to Kant and Hegel being in the background, right, as well as Karl.
Right.
So Brentano is the really the founder of phenomenology, although he didn't call it phenomenology, but he sort of got some of the ideas on the table and was the teacher of, interestingly, the teacher of Husserl, among other important intellectuals of that time. Edmund Husserl is the real founder of phenomenology, but Brentano kind of gets it started. Brentano was a defrocked priest, interestingly, right? But he had gotten his education as a seminarian, and so he was very well versed in Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, as well as various forms of modern or contemporary thought of his day. And he really wanted to push back against this psychologism. And I'm not going to go into his thought in any detail, except to say that he discovered what was come to be called intentionality, right? Which was a major idea that Edmund Husserl picked up on, okay? And I'll describe that in a few minutes here, but that was really kind of what helped Husserl get started here. Husserl, by training, was originally a mathematician. And one of the things that mathematicians, I think this is just true if you study much philosophy, people who enter philosophy through mathematics almost always end up being Platonists of some sort, right? They love, because they love deductive certitude, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the thing that's beautiful about math and pure logic, right, is it has a deductive certitude and purity to it. That you don't get with the empirical sciences, right? Because the empirical sciences are inductive and they have to be revised, and there's new evidence and all that sort of thing, right? So Husserl was very, Edmund Husserl was a Czech philosopher, was very, just to put it, pissed off about psychologism, right? Because he was saying, look, you can't say that crap about math and logic. Right. Whatever you want to say about reducing everything to your feelings of shame or your powerless or your psychological needs, right? Whatever. Yeah. That's not true about math, right? It's not true about pure logic. And so what Husserl wanted to do was to develop a defense of the objectivity of math and logic, right? Now, to do that, though, he said, what we need to do is we need to get a science of consciousness. Yeah. Because math and logic are constructed by consciousness. Now, I said Platonist a minute ago. Husserl could have gone real Platonist. Like, if you're a real Platonist, then you think mathematical objects and logical objects exist in a separate reality, right? Yeah,
they have real being.
Let's have real being. That's right. Husserl didn't want to make that move. He wanted to say that they attained a certain kind of objectivity in human consciousness, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And in doing so, he does tip his hand a little bit, because who does that sound like? It sounds a little bit like Kant, right?
Yeah.
And he does acknowledge early in his work that he has some sort of what I would call neo-Kantian leanings, right? Yeah. He doesn't go as far as Kant, but he wants to say that we can find within consciousness itself the structures that make mathematics and logics objective and universal, right? Do you see the move there? Right?
Yeah. So you want to, it's because of kind of the material pendulum. Is there, you want to try to recover some of the idealism that was lost after Kant and after that. So I mean, it makes sense. I get it.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah. And so he defines phenomenology this way. He says phenomenology is the science of the essential structures of consciousness, right? Again, sounds a little Kantian, right? When you really think about it, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to bracket. This is interesting, right? He has this thing called epoche, right? And what that is, it's a bracketing. And we're going to bracket any accounts of any metaphysical account of the objects of consciousness, right? And we're just going to reflect on and observe the objects of consciousness as they present themselves within consciousness, right? Without, again, trying to give a ontological critique, right? Are they really real? Stop.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's really what he's doing in phenomenology. Now, again, he's striving for objectivity. Okay. So we don't want to attribute to him a kind of subjectivism that wouldn't be
right. Yeah.
At the same time, you can see here, this is a kind of reflection into our subjectivity, right?
Oh, yeah.
And there's no doubt about that. Now, this is going to sound really weird, but he thinks, though, there are objective structures within subjectivity itself, right, that we can bring out, right, through a sufficient and rigorous reflection, right? Now, yeah, because some of this sounds a little soft, but he thought of this as really being a very rigorous kind of science, right? And that the way you did this was by looking at ideas and reducing ideas to the most basic ones, right? Looking at experience and reducing them to the most basic kinds of experience, right? And then using what he called eidetic reduction eidetic, eidos, right? That's kind of back to essences, right?
Yeah.
But again, essences in our consciences, right? In our conscience. Yes, conscience. All right. In consciousness. It starts to get hard to say. Awareness. Let's go with awareness, right?
Awareness.
Yeah. And then we can find the structures that are the most essential. All right. To thinking. Okay. Now, I'm not going to get into that too much in the course. I'll have 2 classes on it and we'll get down into the details. There's a lot there to explore.
There is.
A lot of people, are inspired, quite inspired by Edmund Husserl, including people like Edith Stein and JP2, right? Is also
Dietrich von Hildebrand.
Sure, yeah. So there's some good folks, but also very interestingly some others, right? Like Heidegger, right, who was a student of Husserl. But just very briefly, just as an overview of Husserl, he became quite influential, had a lot of important students. It's most scholars concede that by the middle or end of his career, he had gone ahead and moved towards, I guess, what you might again say something like transcendental idealism, because because by that time he's sort of saying, like, I just don't know. We don't know anything about reality except as what's given within the structures of consciousness, right? Yeah. Those structures are objective, right, et cetera, right? But he gets back to that point, right? Yeah. One really interesting thing is about it is he does say that the most fundamental kind of consciousness we have after intentionality is time consciousness, right? So those, like, whenever you're studying phenomenology, and we'll talk about this some, intentionality as well as time consciousness are 2 of the major sort of pillars there. Heidegger is a student, famous and infamous student of Husserl. Okay, so phenomenology is the background.
Yeah,
really. A lot of people ask, where does Heidegger come from? Where does existentialism come from? Well, there's an answer: phenomenology, right? Heidegger is the student of Husserl, right? And he likes a lot of what Husserl has to say, but he takes a very different turn, right? And his turn is to say, look, Husserl, you've got it exactly backwards. It's so funny how this works, right? Like in modern philosophy, you've got it exactly backwards. It's not about consciousness, it's about being. And that sounds good at first, right? Yeah. What we need to recognize is that it's not so much that we need to find objectivity through exploring consciousness. It's rather that consciousness is an extension of the objectivity of being. So it's all part of one thing, right? In Heidegger's view, kind of a continuum, I should say, right? And what consciousness is what he calls Dasein, right? And that's this famous term he kind of puts together that basically is meant to communicate this idea that consciousness is just being showing itself, right? So it's an extension of being, and it's where being discloses itself to itself, right? Kind of weird kind of way of putting it, right? But you can kind of accept some of it. But what he thinks is that if we pay attention then to consciousness, we see being perfectly, just as it is, exactly, right? Without any need for interpretive overlap. He thinks that what's happened, though, is over the history of philosophy, since Plato, right?
Bold claim.
Yeah, right. You see, like the pre-Socratics are on the right path, right? But since Plato, we have fallen into the oblivion of being, right?
Yeah.
And because of that, we've lost contact with being as well as our own human being, right? And so here is where philosophy begins to take this turn towards existentialism, right? And the work of Martin Heidegger. Again, there's a lot of details you could go into there, and we will in the course. But there, the essential question then becomes, how do we recover being, right? How do we recover ourselves? And this is where we encounter terms like authenticity, inauthenticity, all right, coming to the fore, right? Because if we can recover being, then we can recover ourselves, right? And stop living in this kind of oblivion and inauthenticity that we go through in modern life, right? So you saw there was something wrong with modern life, right?
Yeah.
It had to do with our detachment from being, including our own human being. Interesting, right?
Yeah. Now, did he have some kind of did he have the same view of like universals that Plato did?
No, he thinks the idea of universals is one of the worst distortions of being, right? Like those are the kinds of ideas that drive us away from the authenticity of being and the authenticity of our own human being, right? So ideas like eternity, ideas like universals, the eternal, the universal, the unchanging, all of that is just distorting crap, right? Heidegger's view, right? It really destroys the human spirit, he thinks. He's picking up a little bit of this from his readings of Nietzsche as well, because he's also influenced by Nietzsche, right?
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, so again, there's a lot of details there. Using the phenomenological method, though, he, including eidetic reduction, he comes down to the view that his most famous book is Being in Time, right? And you could change the title to Being is Time, right? Because that's eventually what he ends up saying is, that time and being are the same thing. Being is nothing different than time. Time is nothing different than being, right? And we're just an extension of that. We don't like that because that includes our death, right? We want to project ourselves beyond, right? Beyond death, right? But that is where we fall into inauthenticity, right?
Now, is that similar to Hegel or no?
There's some similarities there. Sure.
Yeah. Did he believe? Yeah. Oh, it's so fascinating.
He didn't believe in an absolute mind, right? Because that starts to make something that's eternal, right?
Eternal, absolutely.
There's nothing eternal. We're just part of the flow of time, and time, and so to recover authenticity, to recover being, to live authentically, right, and to be at peace, we need to accept that, right? He calls it to recover our authenticity, we have to embrace lucid resolution in the face of death, right? And that death is our ultimate horizon, right? Very interestingly, when you look at both Hans von Balthasar and I'm forgetting his name right now. Well, there's a kind of a guy who's a Protestant who's kind of a parallel to von Balthasar.
Karl Barth. Yeah,
thank you, appreciate it. They're both very influenced by Heidegger, and Benedict XVI through von Balthasar, right, is as well. Now, of course, they're Christians, right, and so they interpret things differently. But the whole idea, I'm sure you've heard this idea of in Benedict XVI and in von Balthasar about the horizon of death, right? And whether or not we go beyond the horizon of death. Well, all that language comes straight out of Heidegger, right?
Heidegger.
So
Yeah.
they're sort of Christianizing, right, a kind of existentialist approach. Now, out of Martin Heidegger, comes existentialism, because one of the things he says is that, as Dasein, we exist. What he means by that is we set out, right? We go into the world, right? We're not just like a badger, right? But as Dasein, as being as consciousness, we're aware of possibilities, right? And so we experience this kind of radical freedom. And that's what the French existentialists picked up on, in particular Jean-Paul Sartre. So again, where did all these things come from? They come from phenomenology, okay? Right? There's Husserl, there's Heidegger, and then there's Jean-Paul Sartre, right? Again, I won't go into all the details here, right, with existentialism, but it's really an outgrowth of this idea of so Jean-Paul Sartre takes one part of, say, Heidegger's philosophy and really develops it into this kind of idea of really radical freedom and atheism.
Right. Yeah, and I think for our listeners to understand, especially when it comes to theology, that theologians have always, seen the place of philosophy, and that philosophy serves theology in this way. So I think, for theologians during this time, right, you experience new philosophies, and you may ask yourself, can this be of service to theology? And so I think a lot of them, some of the ones we've mentioned, Balthasar, JP2, Dietrich von Hildebrand, Karl Barth, like a lot of them were, genuinely, trying to make use of this new and, what they probably thought, hopefully developed philosophy to serve theology.
Sure. Yeah. And I have myself, sometimes Christians get into an argument about the relationship between culture and theology, right?
Yeah.
And should your doctrine is just reflecting American culture or something like that, right? And what I want to say is I don't have a problem with culture impacting and being used by theology, because it's inevitable. I mean, you just like your thought that you can get escape that is just false, right? You're going to be mediating and developing these ideas within a particular intellectual milieu, right? And you just can't help it, right? Now, the question though is this philosophy adequate to the use, right? I think that's a better, so I'm not going to beat up on any theologian for saying, oh, he used some Heidegger or whatever, right? That's fine, right? You're going to have to use some sort of philosophy. Your question though is it adequate, right? And I'll say something about that here at the end. But yeah, that's a good observation, Jason.
All right, so where do we go after Heidegger?
Basically into existentialism, right? Existentialism, I'll have a class on that. And he talks really as it explores this idea of radical freedom that we set out, that we're not in essence, is the basic idea of existentialism. There's no human essence, right? There's no human blueprint, right? This is why atheism is necessary, because he says, look, if there was a God, then there would be a blueprint in the mind of God, right? And we couldn't become whatever we choose, right? But we can become whatever we choose. This sounds very familiar, I suppose, contemporary debates, because there is no God and there is no blueprint, right? And because of our consciousness, we are radically free. And even what we radically free, even in terms of epistemology, right? We first choose to decide what to count as evidence, right? So you might choose to become a traditionalist Catholic, or you might choose to become a Marxist, or you might choose to be an biology department at a university. All of those are just choices, right? And you could have chosen just as well chosen otherwise, right? There's no immediate middle point to adjudicate between those choices, right? So there's kind of, you can see there's a certain attractiveness to this if you're a rebel in the 1950s, right? When he's working, right? Jean-Paul Sartre is your prototypical or sort of paradigmatic, French philosopher smoking a cigarette with a turtleneck on and a beret and all that sort of thing, right? So existentialism was, enormously impactful
Sure.
For about a decade, right? Over time, though, it lost ground to both neo-Marxism and postmodernism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or critical theory and postmodernism. Again, there's a lot to go into details here, and I just can't. But I'll just say in broad strokes, the kinds of concerns about consciousness and freedom that you find developing out of Husserl and through Heidegger and into existentialism get socialized and politicized in neo-Marxism and postmodernism, right? Neo-Marxism takes that Marxist critique. Sometimes it goes, it's called the Frankfurt School. Sometimes it's called critical theory, right? Whatever it may be, but takes that Marxist view that economics, right? That all of history is the unfolding of economic competition between classes, economic oppression, and the competition for the means of production. It takes that, though, and amplifies it and extends it to all considerations, right? Between the races, between the classes, between different cultures, between men and women, et cetera, right? So you get the idea that really history has been the unfolding of the oppressed and the oppressor, right? And
and I think this really sets the stage for our modern culture and experience of everything being subjected to the political, that politics is the umbrella and everything else is underneath it. Therefore, we look at everything, even things that, 5 years ago, we'd be like, this is not a political issue. All of a sudden becomes the political issue, right?
Yeah, your use of pronouns, all sorts of things like that, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, so grammar, right? Grammar is political, right?
Yeah.
Just think about that. We have these folks to thank for that. But you think about, so the kinds of things that Sartre was concerned with in terms of human freedom, right? And again, he was interested in authenticity. He thought very often we wouldn't embrace our radical freedom, right? Instead, we would, believe in God or believe in a political movement or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, what the critical theorist said about the existentialists is, well, that's naive, right? Because consciousness never really is free. It's always hemmed in by and conditioned by the dialectic of oppression. Do you see? Right. So there's a consistent theme through all of this, and that is consciousness, right?
Yeah.
What is consciousness? What is subjectivity? And even our own subjectivity, the critical theorists would say, are preconditioned, right, by the oppressor-oppressed dialectic, right?
Yeah.
So our considerations of what's a man, what's a woman, what's civilization, what's barbarism, right? All of that is preconditioned by the dialectic of oppressor and oppressed, right?
Yeah.
So,
and you see this, and you see that, you find that theme throughout. Again, that becomes really an umbrella from which to rethink everything, including, even in just kind of educational philosophy.
Right.
The idea of the oppressed and the oppressor, how to find these and stuff, and really kind of breeds the foundations of liberation theology.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And so much of the plagues of modern education theology, everything, so much.
So one last thing here, I'll just say about postmodernism, right? It's very closely allied with critical theory or neo-Marxism. They grew up very close together. Postmodernism, again, involves a kind of subjectivity here. The basic idea, again, this is the basic idea. There's a lot more to be said. But that everything is a development is that consciousness is conditioned as a social construct, right?
Yeah.
So that consciousness and all the deliverances of consciousness are social constructs, right? Usually developed at the behest of the powerful and at the harm of the marginalized. But in any event, our ideas about meaning, about value, about even the ideas about objectivity, that's Western, right? It's supposed to be Western and male, right? Rather than Eastern and something else, right? So all of those things are, whenever we think, see, again, this is kind of, again, as I said, all of these worries about consciousness right, that we get in Husserl, Heidegger,
Yeah.
Sartre, they become politicized and socialized in contemporary thought, in postmodern thought, right? So consciousness itself is a social construct. So what we need to do is deconstruct, right, our ideas, our beliefs, our consciousness, because really those are not about reality, right? Those are just expressions of our social conditioning, right?
Yeah, and we're living in a time where we want to, we're I don't know if we've succeeded yet, but of deconstructing a lot of that. But then though, because in Neo-Marxism and critical theory, you have those two classes, we need to deconstruct it, but then reconstruct it according to who we have perceived as the marginalized.
That's right.
Right. So we need to, they're not saying we just need to, kind of devolve into some sort of just subjectivity, like kind of like absolute relativism or something like that, but reconstructed from the point of view of the marginalized, which however defined and however
that creates a difficult paradox, right? Because then the marginalized become the powerful, and the formerly powerful become the marginalized. Some postmodern theorists will accept that that's true, and they would just say, well, what we have to do is have endless revolution, endless deconstruction. Right. So we just kind of keep the churn going. Some of them do believe that we can reach a state where we are completely deconstructed. Sounds weird, right?
Yeah.
And also completely free. But it's kind of like this kind of utopian thing where you're just, but maybe our society is reaching towards this, where you're constantly coming to be something new every day, every moment, right? And there's no boundaries or restrictions. It's fluid, right? Instead of thinking of structure, just think of fluids interacting, right? That's kind of right, maybe the image. Okay, so
that's maddening. Yeah,
that's one part of it. So I hope everybody sees that's what's one part of our intellectual culture today, right? There's this radical subjectivity, right, that we've gotten ourselves into, but it's a radical subjectivity that's socialized, right? So subjectivity and socialization and politicization. Now there's the opposite extreme we also experience, and this is more British and American, right? Historically, kind of in the Anglo-American world, as it's sometimes called, and that's the heritage of analytic philosophy, right?
Okay.
So analytic philosophy really grows out of the work of G.E. Moore, not exclusively, also Frege, who's a logician on the continent, but analytic philosophy, very similar, not the same as logical positivism, which is a continental movement, really wanted to say, okay, idealism is done, and what we need to do is just do science and stop screwing around, right?
Yeah.
This is kind of like your hard-nosed, let's be empiricist, let's be physical. There is an objective reality. It's not all this stuff like feelings and so forth, right? It's none of that, okay? It has nothing to do with feelings, values, all that stuff is rubbish, okay? Anything that goes beyond, essences, forms, rubbish, God, rubbish, right? There's physical reality, and we can study physical reality with science. And the job of philosophy is to kind of clean up the loose ends, right?
Yeah.
Because there are some loose ends, right? So philosophy becomes problem solving. It's not system building, right? Analytic philosophy. And if you're studying analytic philosophy, you find this, right? Like it doesn't build systems, unlike continental philosophy or ancient medieval philosophy. It solves problems, right?
Yeah, it's almost purely practical.
Yeah, right.
Is that a good way to look at it? Maybe. Yeah, and like you said, it's refuting the idealism.
Yeah.
But again, it seems to be just reducing real knowledge to the material.
Just the material. That's right. Yeah.
Just the material.
So you and interestingly, consciousness is the biggest problem for them, right?
Yeah.
And they're always dealing with trying to figure out ways to reduce consciousness to the brain, right?
Yeah.
They call it, it's really funny, they call it the problem of consciousness, right? Because it's one of the things that doesn't fit the picture, right, as neatly.
Yeah.
G.E. Moore, though, in the early part of the 20th century, if I remember correctly, it's really in the 1905, 1907, something like that. Maybe it's not quite that old, but it's around then. Writes a famous article called The Reputation of Idealism. and sets himself up to refute idealism in England, which was the dominant philosophy, and he succeeds. Idealism was already a little bit on the wane, but he really kicks it in the teeth, right? And really from him and some other thinkers in America, you get the beginnings of, again, we go from extremes, from idealism to physicalism, right?
Yeah.
Everything has to be science, everything has to be physical. The logical positivism is a very extreme version of that. They use what they call the verification principle, right? So if it's not directly experienced or proven by science, then it's nonsense, right? It's kind of that kind of thing, right? And so, in the fields of, in this develops in analytic philosophy. This is true up through today, right? In terms of epistemology, you have what's called scientism, and in terms of metaphysics, you have physicalism, right? And probably about the closest you get in ethics is consequentialism, right?
Yeah.
A kind of pleasure pain calculus, right? Satisfaction, dissatisfaction calculus, because that's a physical phenomena, right? And you can kind of imagine maybe that you can measure it. I don't think you really can, but whatever. That's about what you end up with, right? And consequentialism can kind of fit that picture, right? So on epistemology, when I say scientism, I mean that science is the only form of knowledge, right? And that anything outside of that is just kind of guessing, right? Maybe it's creative, but it's creative like art. It's not really the hard-nosed objectivity. Objectivity is in the scientific method. Anything outside the scientific method is not objective, period, right?
Yeah, which you get into, like you said, like morals.
That's right.
So every single moral decision is not based on principles, but on the circumstances of that particular choice.
That's right. Yeah.
That there's
and probably the closest thing you can get is health.
Yeah. Now so much of this is sounding familiar.
Right. Health is the ultimate good, right? It's more important than freedom. It's more important than virtue. It's more important than anything, right?
Yeah. So especially if you don't believe in heaven or any sort of good outside of this earthly life.
Right. That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
Health is hugely important.
Of course it is. That's right. Yeah.
Especially if something like happiness is subjective. And completely subjective, right? What's the one thing that we should help guarantee people so that they can find their own happiness?
Right. Yeah.
Health.
Yeah. And you think about it, happiness is really a physical feeling, right? As the way most people understand it, right? That is feelings of satisfaction, right? So it can kind of fit that picture. On the other side, you have physicalism, right? It's just another way of talking about materialism, but that everything is reducible to. In reality, all that is real is reducible to, as in can be identified with, the purposeless interaction of subatomic particles, right? So that your conversation, my conversation, your reality, what you are, okay, is the byproduct of the purposeless interaction of subatomic particles, right?
It sounds like a Valentine's Day card. Like the worst Valentine's Day.
The worst Valentine's, right? This involves all sorts of interesting moves. As I say, probably consciousness is the problem they consider the hardest. Sure. So there's a lot of work done to try to reduce all mental phenomena to physical phenomena. One sort of strain you encounter here is what's called epiphenomenalism, right? Which is the view that that thoughts are not causal; they're simply some sort of accidental byproduct of brain operations, right? So you don't do anything because of your thoughts, right? In fact, thoughts might not even exist, but if they do exist, they're just sort of like. They're like the steam rising up off of or smoke rising up off of a volcano, right? They're just a byproduct. They're not causal, right? in any ways, right? So your beliefs about, say, freedom or love or anything like that, they don't actually motivate any of your action, right? Your actions because of prior physical states that cause you to do stuff, right? and then there's these thoughts that just kind of, they're like, say, they're like smoke coming off the top of a volcano. They're just byproduct.
Yeah. And they're easily wiped away.
That's right. Obviously, in such a conception, right, you don't have any room for God and very little room for ethics. You can try to piece something together, consequentialism, but even that, I think, under pressure, ends up falling apart. Certainly, any idea of transcendence, the soul, God, eternal forms, all of that's out the window, right? So here we are, Jason. Right? You've got two choices, right?
Yeah.
Go with politicized consciousness or materialistic reduction.
Yeah.
Which do you choose? Choose one. Choose wisely. It's a terrible situation, right? And I think it's ended up putting us in what some scholars terribly enough call postmodernism. Or postmodern realism, right, as being the condition, in which, postmodern realism sounds almost like a contradiction, right? But basically, it's a way to try to grasp our current intellectual setup, which is that objectivity and truth are quarantined within science. Everything outside of that is politicized consciousness, right? Yeah, in which there is no objectivity. There's only kind of oppression, right? An oppressor.
Whatever the mighty decides to construct.
That's right. Yeah.
Right.
So you have a politicized consciousness, right? And so, which ends up being kind of in a way still subjective, right? As you have, like, it's not that there's anything that's really true or good or honorable or beautiful. It's just the powerful and the powerless, right?
Yeah, it's almost a form of relativism that's not based on the individual, but on just the society with which you live.
That's right. Yeah, that's a good way.
So we can construct our own society as we see fit, apart from everything else that has gone before us, and we don't have to take any cues or anything like that. So, and that's why, having that as your premise, that's how I think you can see how people in our society make moves that we would just say, why would you make that move? Let's just completely deconstruct, marriage or something that has literally been, a staple of society, or at least of Western culture.
Because it's a form of oppression, man.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what you have to grasp, right?
Yeah.
And so we're in a situation, it seems to me obviously not sustainable. Right.
Yeah.
Intellectually, if you are not one of the oppressed class, then you're disqualified from conversation, except for maybe about science. Science is the only thing that's objective, but clearly science can't solve a lot of the questions we have. Science is very good at solving certain kinds of questions and problems, right? But it's not good at telling us what's beautiful, what's honorable, what's good. It's not good at telling us about whether or not there's something to reality that goes beyond the physical, right? It's just not set up to do that, right? It can't even really justify its own epistemological presuppositions. Again, it's just not set up to do that, right? It's set up to do a certain kind of thing. And so really, I think what we've got is our culture and our public discourse is caught in this cognitive dysfunctionality, right? Between scientism and politicized consciousness, such that we can't really figure anything out. We can't form an effective public reason because these two forms of thought corrupt public reason to such a degree, right? And it's almost really the absence of philosophy, right? We don't have a philosophy, right, that can bear the weight of public reason.
Yeah. Did we have one before? Maybe.
Maybe we did.
Maybe we did. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. I think it's a long story of how it fell apart. That's part of what we've been talking about.
Yeah, and it's absolutely fascinating. I think I think the new course, I'm excited for this new course to roll out and everything. I mean, just to, I think just to help people with, how did we get here? Like it is an absolutely fascinating story of, how are we processing our own thinking? How are we building structures of thought and all these things? And where did we go wrong? Did we get anything right? Right? Is there a better system than looking at Aristotle, or even just taking in the ancients as opposed to just beginning philosophy and with the Enlightenment and things. So I think this will be a very helpful course. And I think I want to encourage all of our listeners to look for it. It'll be forthcoming at Catholic Studies Academy, and really just to help us to understand the world we live in, so that we can move forward. It's when you're if you're going on a hike and you look, you're on the trail, and you have a map of the trail, but you don't know where you are at on the map itself. You see the trail, you're on the trail, but you don't know where you're at on the map. It's very difficult to see where you're going, right? So this course, I think, will do a good job of really helping us show us the foundations for modern thought and modern political discourse. And hopefully by understanding this, we can form new paths forward towards like we said, all that is true, good, and beautiful. That's right. So check out all of our content over at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com. Until next time, God bless.